Congratulations. I always knew you had it in you.
What do you want?
Just what I'm owed. 8 years of my life went into everything you built.
You signed away every right you had.
Paperwork from a marriage where you hid what that company was worth?
That won't hold. I didn't hide anything.
Half of that helicopter is mine.
8 years after she walked out with the house, the savings, and every asset she could convert to cash, Mallory called to congratulate me. She sounded warm, generous even. But before the call ended, she said the one thing she should never have said: she wanted the helicopter. Not a share of our old life. The helicopter I bought with a company she had already signed away. She had no idea what I had been holding on to. But when she found out how much of what she thought she'd won was going to vanish. If you've ever built something while the people around you called it a waste of time, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with this channel. We tell the stories they don't expect anyone to remember. The first thing people usually ask when they find out how much Aerospan is worth is whether I always knew it would get there. The honest answer is no. I knew the technology worked. I knew the problem it solved was real and that no one else had built anything close to it. But knowing something is worth building and knowing it will be worth billions are two very different things. And back then I was spending most of my energy just keeping the lights on in a rented hangar at Red Mesa Executive Air Park, running simulations that crashed more often than they completed and telling myself that the next iteration would be the one that finally held. What I was building was a coordination network. A system that could link cargo planes, rescue helicopters, and unmanned aerial vehicles into a single managed airspace. The idea was straightforward in concept and brutal in execution. Every existing system treated those aircraft as separate problems. Mine treated them as one. If it worked, it could cut transit times, reduce fuel waste, and open air corridors into regions where ground infrastructure was too weak to support traditional logistics. The application in emergency medical transport alone was significant enough to justify the entire project. But in those early years, the project existed mostly as several thousand lines of incomplete code, a simulation model that failed under load, and a stack of equipment lease invoices that I was paying out of my own salary. My wife, Mallory, had a different relationship with those invoices. She wasn't indifferent to what I was building, she simply had no patience for the timeline it required. She wanted results in a form that other people could see: a larger house, vacations that cost enough to be worth mentioning, a husband whose success was legible without explanation. She'd compare me to men in her professional circle who drove certain cars and held certain titles, and she'd say it without cruelty, just as observation, the way someone might note that a neighbor had repainted their front door. The comparison was always there, always quiet, and it said the same thing every time: what you're doing doesn't count yet. I understood what she meant. I just didn't agree that yet was a problem. She did, and that difference more than anything else is what ended our marriage. By the time she filed the paperwork, we'd been living around each other for the better part of 2 years, polite, functional, and completely disconnected. The divorce itself was not dramatic. Under the settlement, Mallory took the house in Benbrook, the majority of our joint savings and investment accounts, a balancing payment of $650,000, and everything of immediate value inside the house. What I kept was Aerospan Dynamics, which at that point was generating almost no revenue, along with the pending patent applications, the leased equipment carrying its associated debt, and all obligations tied to the hangar. The agreement included a clause in which Mallory explicitly waived any rights to future appreciation in the company or the technology I was developing. She signed without hesitation, and I remember watching her do it, and understanding exactly what she believed in that moment: that she was taking the real assets and leaving me with the liability. She wasn't wrong that Aerospan was a liability. She was wrong about what it would become. 8 years later, Aerospan Dynamics operates as one of the largest private airspace coordination platforms in the country. The technology runs inside medical transport networks, emergency freight systems, and corridor management programs across multiple states. The company's valuation crossed $11 billion in the most recent independent assessment, and my ownership stake puts my personal net worth at approximately $2.8 billion. I don't mention that figure often. It still feels like something that belongs to a different person, or rather to the same person who just hasn't caught up to the number yet. The one thing I bought for myself that felt deliberate was the helicopter. A twin-engine aircraft I named Blue Meridian, used primarily to travel between Aerospan's headquarters, our testing facilities, and remote aviation projects that commercial routes don't reach efficiently. Mallory once called what I did in that hangar a hobby. Blue Meridian was the answer to that, though I never said so out loud and I never needed to. Aerospan held a dedication ceremony for a new coordination center at Cobalt Run Aviation Campus. I arrived in Blue Meridian and a photographer from an aviation trade publication captured the moment. Me stepping away from the helicopter, the campus behind me, and the image ended up in several business outlets alongside coverage of the company's valuation. It was the kind of exposure I'd spent most of my career avoiding, but the coordination center was significant enough that the public moment felt warranted. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Mallory. She opened with congratulations, her tone warm and almost nostalgic, and she said she'd always known I was capable of something like this. There was a version of that sentence that might have been genuine. The version she used sounded rehearsed. I let her finish and then asked what she actually wanted, and the warmth in her voice didn't disappear. It just changed shape, became something more formal and purposeful, and she began to talk about Aerospan. Her position was that the company's foundational technology had been developed during our marriage using shared financial resources during a period when she was supporting the household so that I could pursue the project. She argued that the waiver clause in our settlement was unenforceable because I had concealed the company's true commercial potential at the time of signing. She wanted a portion of my current equity in Aerospan, a portion of my personal assets, a corresponding interest in the patents, and half the value of Blue Meridian. When I asked why she was including the helicopter, she said it had been purchased with profits from a company she helped build. She didn't call it a demand. She called it her share. I didn't argue with her on the phone. There was nothing to gain from it. And I had learned a long time ago that the instinct to correct someone in the moment is usually a way of making yourself feel better while making the situation worse. I told her I'd be in touch and ended the call. Then I picked up the phone again, this time to call Marissa Gentry. Marissa has built her practice around asset disputes, intellectual property litigation, and cases involving business interests that cross into family law. She is methodical in a way that some people find cold and I find reassuring. She reviewed the settlement agreement, listened to my account of the call, and confirmed that the waiver clause was clearly drafted. Then she explained that Mallory wasn't actually asking to reopen the asset division, she was alleging fraud. If Mallory could demonstrate that I had knowingly withheld material information about Aerospan's value during the divorce, a court could revisit the settlement on those grounds. The case itself, regardless of outcome, would create disruption. Regulatory filings, investor notifications, potential freezes on asset transfers. The lawsuit didn't have to win to cost me something significant. It just had to exist long enough to make me want to make it go away. Marissa asked how I wanted to proceed, and I told her I wasn't paying Mallory anything. I understood the calculus. A settlement payment would be faster and cleaner, but if I paid, I would be confirming a claim that had no legal merit and establishing a precedent that Mallory could return to whenever she needed money, and I had more of it to take. I chose to fight. Marissa said she'd need everything: financial records, email archives, patent filings, bank statements, corporate documents, hard drives, anything that touched Aerospan from the period of our marriage forward. Most of what she needed was already organized in our company records, but some of the earliest material, the documentation from the first 2 years before Aerospan had a proper filing system, was in physical storage near the original hangar. I drove out there on a Tuesday afternoon and worked through 4 hours of boxes before I found what I was looking for. Most of it was what I expected: lease agreements, early correspondence with equipment vendors, printed out simulation logs from the period when we were still running everything locally. What I did not expect was the hard drive. It was sitting inside a box of old testing hardware, wrapped in an anti-static sleeve and labeled with a date that put it roughly 3 years into our marriage. I brought it back to the office and had it imaged before I opened anything, and what was on it changed the shape of everything. There were emails, a sustained exchange between Mallory and a man named Dominic. Dominic had worked as a technology commercialization consultant I had hired to help Aerospan identify institutional investors during an early funding push. The emails on that drive had been sent from approximately 18 months before Mallory filed for divorce, and the content described in specific terms a plan he had walked her through transferring money from our joint credit line into a shell company structured as consulting fees and broken into amounts small enough to avoid generating alerts. The total transferred was $186,000. There were also emails in which Mallory described sending Dominic copies of my technology presentations, my test client lists, and the detailed outlines of the patent applications I was preparing to file. I had spent years believing Mallory had left because she genuinely believed the project would fail, that her calculation was honest, even if it was wrong. What the drive told me was something different. She hadn't left because she thought Aerospan was worthless. She had taken what she could carry and arranged for someone else to receive the rest. And she had done all of this while still living in our house, while I was still in the hangar, still running the simulations, still believing that the version of our life I was building was something we were building together. I handed the drive to Marissa and told her to open a full financial investigation. She looked at the summary I'd prepared, set it on her desk, and said, "This is not a divorce dispute anymore." She was right. But I didn't know yet how much further back the plan actually went. Marissa had been doing this long enough to know when a case was about to get complicated, and the morning after I handed her the hard drive, she called to tell me it already had. Mallory's legal team had filed a motion to reopen the divorce settlement on grounds of fraudulent concealment, and her attorney, Neil Pomeroy, had simultaneously petitioned the court to issue a temporary restraining order, preventing me from selling equity-transferring assets or altering the ownership structure of Blue Meridian while the dispute was pending. It was a standard aggressive opening, create the maximum amount of institutional pressure before the other side has time to organize a response. Marissa told me not to be surprised if it worked at least temporarily, because courts tend to be cautious when a billionaire is on one side and a waiver clause is on the other. She was right to warn me. Within the week, the story had moved from trade publications into general business media, and the framing was predictable: founder of aviation tech. Giant faces allegations of asset concealment in divorce proceedings. None of the coverage said I had done anything wrong, but the implication was structural. The question existed, which meant the doubt existed, which meant the story had legs, regardless of how it resolved. Aerospan's board reached out through our general counsel to express concern about a pending federal contract and an international investment round that was still in active negotiation. They didn't ask me to step back. They asked me to be careful, which in that context meant the same thing. It was during this period that Mallory suggested we meet privately before things became, her word, unmanageable. I agreed, and she named a restaurant near the Stockyards district in Fort Worth, somewhere public and neutral. I drove there expecting a conversation between two people trying to find a number they could both accept. What I found instead was Dominic Raines sitting beside her in the booth. He was dressed in the way that consultants who have had some success tend to dress: expensive but not specific, the kind of suit that signals access without committing to a particular world. And he took over the conversation almost immediately, which told me something about the actual structure of what was happening. This wasn't Mallory pursuing a legal strategy she had developed independently. This was Dominic's operation, and Mallory was the instrument he had chosen because she had legal standing that he didn't. Dominic laid out the risks in the calm, organized way of someone who had mapped the terrain before arriving a valuation dispute could drag Aerospan's proprietary architecture into public court filings, erode government partner confidence, and run for years before reaching any resolution. The implication was that I was facing a problem too large and too expensive to fight, and that the intelligent choice was to settle. He proposed a significant cash payment to Mallory, along with a transfer of interest equivalent to half the appraised value of Blue Meridian. Mallory said very little during this part of the conversation. She let him speak, and when he finished, she added that she had given 8 years of her life, and that the success I'd built hadn't come from nothing. I didn't argue with either of them. I let Dominic finish his presentation, noted the specific language he used, and watched the way Mallory deferred to him on every structural point. Before I left, I sent Marissa a 2-word message: confirmed. What the discovery process revealed over the following weeks was more complete than I had anticipated. The shell company that had received the $186,000 from our joint credit line had never been dissolved. 6 weeks after our divorce was finalized, those funds were moved into a new entity called Altitude Crest Ventures, which Mallory and Dominic had co-founded together. That company had attempted to develop an airspace coordination platform in the 2 years following our divorce, working from materials that bore a clear resemblance to my early Aerospan documentation. The project collapsed because they had the plans, but not the algorithm. The core routing logic I had written myself, which existed nowhere except in the software I had built and the mind that built it. The discovery filings also produced something that recontextualized Dominic's role entirely during the period when he was consulting for Aerospan. When I was paying him to help me find institutional investors, he was simultaneously in a relationship with Mallory that neither of them had disclosed. That relationship created a direct conflict of interest. In his professional capacity, Dominic owed Aerospan a fiduciary duty to protect confidential information and place the client's interests above his own, and using his access to our technology presentations and client pipeline to build a competing venture with my wife while I was paying him for the privilege of that access was not a judgment lapse. It was a textbook breach, and Marissa began preparing a formal complaint to the Technology Commercialization Licensing Board. Calvin Reddick had been with Aerospan since the second year of its existence coming aboard when the simulation model finally stabilized, and I needed someone who could manage the engineering team while I focused on the coordination architecture. He'd been with me through every rough period the company had experienced, and when I told him what the discovery was producing, he went back through his own records without being asked. What he found was a complaint filed against Dominic 5 years earlier by another founder, a man who alleged that Dominic had used privileged access to internal patent documents to pressure him into selling his intellectual property at a fraction of its assessed value. The complaint had been settled privately, and Dominic had kept his license, but the pattern was documented. Marissa added it to the file, and we made a decision at that point not to file anything yet. The complaint against Dominic, the transfer records, the evidence of the competing venture. We held all of it because Marissa's reasoning was straightforward. Dominic believed he was in control of the timeline, and if we let him continue to believe that he would keep moving and moving, people make mistakes that stationary people don't. The call my mother received from Mallory happened a few weeks into this period. My mother, Judith, is not someone who is easily rattled, and she didn't mention the call to me until the evening she received it, because she wanted to think through what had been said before she repeated it. Mallory had called to tell her that I was using my money to punish her for leaving, that she had sacrificed her best years managing a household so I could work in a hangar, and that the legal action wasn't greed, it was a woman trying to reclaim what she was owed. Judith listened to all of it without interruption, which Mallory apparently read as sympathy. But somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Mallory said something that didn't fit the emotional register of everything else she mentioned, that she and Dominic were hoping the matter would be resolved before a bank evaluation cycle. The sentence had the texture of financial planning, not of a woman describing an injury, and it landed oddly enough that my mother remembered it precisely because it was out of place, the way a wrong note in a familiar piece of music stays with you after the song has ended. When Judith told me I asked her to put it in writing the exact words, she remembered the date and context of the call, signed and dated. She did it the following morning. Marissa pulled the financial records for Altitude Crest Ventures within 48 hours, and what she found confirmed what the statement implied. The company was carrying substantial debt from a private aviation center development project, and a bridge loan tied to that project was scheduled to mature in approximately 2 months. Mallory and Dominic were not pursuing this lawsuit because they were confident they would win. They were pursuing it because they needed a settlement payment from me to avoid losing an asset that had nothing to do with our marriage. Every week of litigation that didn't end in a check was a week closer to a financial deadline they hadn't disclosed to the court. That changed how Marissa managed the calendar. She began using every procedurally legitimate mechanism available to extend the timeline, and each passing week was costing them something they couldn't replace. It was during this same period that Calvin found the equipment lease file while working through storage records that predated our current document management system. 3 years before Mallory filed for divorce. Not 18 months. Not 2 years, but 3 full years before she signed any settlement paperwork. She had executed a document removing her name from a simulation equipment lease and transferring all payment obligations to me exclusively. The document also contained language specifying that she waived any rights to intellectual property or derivative assets created using that leased equipment. The lawyer who had prepared the transfer agreement had a consistent professional history of working alongside Dominic Raines. The implication of that timing was not subtle if Dominic had directed a lawyer in his network to draft a document releasing Mallory from financial exposure 3 years before the divorce. Then the arrangement between them had not begun 18 months before she filed as the emails suggested. It had begun significantly earlier and had been constructed carefully enough that the early stages left almost no direct trace. The conclusion was unavoidable. Mallory and Dominic had been coordinating for at least 3 years before the day a judge signed our divorce decree. What Mallory had done during that time was methodical. She removed her name from the liabilities, kept her access to household resources, and positioned herself to walk away with the liquid assets while leaving me holding the debt. If the company failed, she lost nothing. If it succeeded, the plan they were now executing was already in place and waiting. I sat with that timeline for a long time after Calvin showed me the file, and what I felt was not quite anger, more like a recalibration, the particular sensation of understanding something you had interpreted incorrectly for years. The story I had told myself about my marriage required no villain. The document in front of me described something else entirely. 2 days before the principal hearing, Neil Pomeroy filed a document that neither Marissa nor I had anticipated. It was a letter of intent, a purchase offer for $25 million addressed to Aerospan, sent 6 weeks before Mallory filed for divorce. The letter was addressed to both Wesley Beckett and Dominic Raines, and if I had received an offer of that magnitude and still declared Aerospan as having negligible value during the settlement proceedings, Mallory had exactly the evidence of fraudulent concealment she needed to collapse the entire agreement. I told Marissa I had never seen that document. She believed me, but believing me and proving it were 2 different problems, and we had a hearing in 48 hours. Judge Ramsey reviewed the filing and issued a temporary preservation order before close of business that same day. A portion of my equity was frozen. The court prohibited any transfer or sale of Blue Meridian. Aerospan was required to notify its investors of the ongoing dispute, and every significant transaction I initiated would require court disclosure until the final hearing concluded. The international investment round went quiet within 24 hours. The story that ran the following morning described a billionaire founder whose assets had been placed under judicial freeze during an investigation into allegations of divorce fraud. Blue Meridian sat in the hangar at Red Mesa with a legal hold notice attached to its registration file, and I had spent 8 years building something that could move people through the air faster than anything that had come before it, and I was watching it sit still because of a document I had never opened. Marissa moved within hours of the preservation order coming through. She had already anticipated that the $25 million offer letter would require a forensic response rather than a legal argument, and she had a digital investigation firm on standby before I finished reading the court filing. The team she brought in specialized in corporate email forensics, recovering access logs, reconstructing deletion histories, and establishing documented chains of custody for electronic communications. They were given access to Aerospan's legacy server infrastructure, the backup archives from the period in question, and every access credential associated with the shared coordination accounts from those early years. The work took 4 days, and what they returned changed the evidentiary landscape of the entire case. The offer letter had been sent to a shared intake address that Dominic managed during his time as our commercialization consultant, one of several addresses that routed external communications into Aerospan's review queue, the kind of arrangement that made sense when a small team was relying on a contractor to manage investor outreach. The forensic logs showed that Dominic had opened the letter within 2 hours of its arrival, downloaded the attachment to a local device, and deleted the email from the shared server before the system's automated forwarding function had a chance to route it to my account. I never received it because he made certain I wouldn't. 3 days after he deleted it, A copy of the document appeared in a cloud storage account belonging to one of the shell entities under Mallory's control, and the forensic team also recovered a message Dominic had sent to Mallory around the same time, retrieved from a backup instance she hadn't known still existed. He told her I didn't need to know about the offer until after the divorce was finalized. That sentence alone would have been enough to collapse her fraud allegation. But there was a second message, this one sent to a business associate rather than to Mallory, that explained what Dominic had actually intended to do with the document he had saved. He wrote that if I ever became too expensive to buy out directly, they would still have something to bring me to the table. The offer letter wasn't just a tool for timing the divorce in their favor. It was a contingency, a piece of leverage he intended to hold indefinitely to be used whenever I stopped being manageable and needed to be reminded that he had information about my company that I didn't. What Dominic had not accounted for was the nature of discovery in civil litigation when you store a document in a business account and that business becomes subject to a court-ordered production request. The document doesn't belong to you anymore in any practical sense. The very thing he had saved as insurance became the clearest evidence of premeditation the case would produce. Marissa had the forensic report authenticated by a second independent firm, reviewed everything with me the evening before the hearing, and said that the document Pomeroy had filed as proof of my concealment had just become proof of theirs. The morning of the final hearing, I was in the courthouse early. During the mid-morning recess, I was standing in the corridor when I heard Mallory's voice behind me. She had come without Dominic. She said she wanted me to understand that things hadn't unfolded the way she had planned, that Dominic had convinced her I was concealing a major deal, that I had known the company was worth something significant, and had structured the settlement to leave her with nothing, and that she had followed his guidance because she believed him, and because she had expected in the end that Aerospan would fail, and I would sell the technology at a loss. She called what had happened a mistake. I didn't dispute how much of the architecture had been Dominic's, the evidence was clear enough on that point. But the thing she was describing was not a single error made in a single moment of poor judgment. Transferring money from our joint accounts, copying and forwarding my working documents, signing a lease transfer prepared by his lawyer, spending the years since the divorce, attempting to build a competing platform on materials she had taken. Those were a sequence of choices, each one requiring her to decide again that she was willing to continue. Dominic had created the opportunity. She had used it every time it was offered to her. I told her I hadn't become someone different since she left. I had been this person the entire time. She had measured me against what I hadn't yet finished building and decided that what she could see wasn't worth staying for. Then I told her she had wanted her share of what we built together, and that today she would receive exactly the share that corresponded to the choices she had made. I walked back into the courtroom and she did not follow. Marissa opened her presentation with the two documents Mallory had signed. The first was the lease transfer agreement executed 3 years before the divorce filing prepared by a lawyer from Dominic's professional network, in which Mallory removed herself from all financial obligations tied to the simulation equipment and simultaneously waived any rights to intellectual property developed using that equipment. The second was the divorce settlement itself, containing the explicit future appreciation waiver she had signed with full legal representation present. Those two documents established the baseline Mallory had surrendered her interest in Aerospan, not once but twice the first time, years before the marriage officially ended. Then Marissa moved to the financial transfers. She walked the court through the $186,000 moved from our joint credit line into the shell company, the subsequent transfer into Altitude Crest Ventures, and the documented attempt to develop a competing platform using materials that had originated inside Aerospan. She presented the evidence of Dominic's concurrent relationship with Mallory during his tenure as our consultant, and the prior complaint filed against him 5 years earlier by another founder describing the same pattern of using privileged access to extract value from a client. The forensic evidence came last. Marissa laid out the server logs, the deletion timestamps, the recovered messages, and the cloud storage records that placed a copy of the $25 million offer inside Mallory's shell entity 3 days after Dominic removed it from my incoming queue. The document Pomeroy had submitted as proof that I had concealed a material asset was in origin and in chain of custody, a document that Dominic had stolen from my company, hidden from me, and preserved for his own future use. The fraud it demonstrated was not mine. Judge Ramsey dismissed Mallory's petition with prejudice, which meant the same claim could not be refiled. The ruling confirmed that Aerospan Dynamics was my separate property, that the post-divorce appreciation of the company had no connection to marital assets, and that Mallory held no interest in the equity, the patents, or any revenue derived from the company's operations. The preservation order on Blue Meridian was vacated immediately, and the asset freeze on my equity was lifted. The court also directed that the financial transfer records, the email deletion logs, and the documentation of Dominic's fiduciary breach be referred to the relevant investigative agencies for review. Marissa filed the professional complaint against Dominic's consulting license the following morning, and the licensing board had the prior complaint already on record. 2 instances of the same conduct, using a client relationship to extract proprietary information for personal gain, was enough to move the matter from investigation to action. His license was suspended pending a formal hearing and subsequently revoked without possibility of reinstatement. The partners working with Altitude Crest Ventures withdrew within weeks of the ruling. The bridge loan came due and the lender declined to extend it. The private aviation center project that Mallory and Dominic had been trying to protect with a settlement payment from me was seized and liquidated against the outstanding debt. Mallory was not left without resources. The assets she had taken from our marriage were still hers, but the investment she and Dominic had built Altitude Crest Ventures around was gone, and she carried a portion of the legal costs from the proceeding. Aerospan disclosed the full outcome of the ruling to the board and to our investor partners. The international round that had gone quiet during the freeze was re-engaged within 3 weeks. The federal contract moved forward on its original schedule. Calvin sent me a message the evening the international deal closed that said only, "Back to work." It was exactly the right thing to say. 1 year after the ruling, I drove out to Red Mesa Executive Air Park on a clear morning in October. The hangar doors were already open when I arrived. Calvin was in the left seat running through the navigation check, calm and precise in the way he always is when there's actual work to be done. My mother was already aboard, buckled into the rear cabin and doing her best to look as though she boarded helicopters on a regular basis. Blue Meridian had completed its final post-freeze maintenance cycle the week before. Every system inspected, every hold notation cleared from the registration file, and it looked exactly as it had the day I brought it home, which is to say, it looked like it was ready. We weren't flying to an industry event or an investor meeting. The destination was a rural medical center several counties east, one that had recently integrated with Aerospan's coordination network, and now served communities that had previously needed several hours of ground transport to reach emergency care. The technology Mallory had once called a game I was playing in a garage was now helping determine how fast a helicopter could reach someone who had run out of time to wait. My phone lit up on the seat beside me just before we lifted. It was a message from Marissa. Dominic's file is closed. License revoked permanently. I read it once and set the phone down. I looked at Calvin running through his final check at my mother in the rear cabin, watching the rotor blades with an expression she was working hard to keep neutral, and I thought about what this aircraft had represented to Mallory, a symbol of what she believed she had missed, a number she felt entitled to a portion of. And I thought about what it actually was, a machine that had been grounded by a legal hold for the better part of a year and was now on a clear morning in October about to do what it was built to do. Nobody who had walked away before the work was finished could own what the work had become. They could file documents and send lawyers and wait for me to choose the easy way out, but the only people who had any real claim on what Aerospan built were the ones who had stayed in the room when it was still a simulation that crashed under load and a stack of invoices nobody else wanted to pay. Here is what I want to leave you with. If you are building something right now that the people closest to you cannot yet see the value of, if the version of your future that you are working toward is invisible to everyone except you, that invisibility is not evidence that you are wrong. It is evidence that you are early. The gap between what a thing looks like at the beginning and what it becomes at the end is where most people stop believing and most builders keep going, and those two groups end up in very different places. Protect what you build. Document what matters. and do not let someone else's impatience become the measure of your potential. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of people who kept going when the math didn't look right yet, and there are many more of them still to tell. The rotors reached operating speed. Calvin ran the final check. I gave the clearance, and Blue Meridian lifted off the tarmac and climbed above the old hangar buildings at Red Mesa, banking east toward open sky. The horizon opened up ahead of us, wide and flat and entirely unobstructed. We had somewhere to be.